So we got this server TS file here. And in this file, we in the end have a very basic Express server. And Express is that Node.js framework that is typically used for building web servers with Node.js. So in here, we have the code for such an Express-powered web server. And this web server is, of course, optimized for wrapping our Angular app, you could say. So for serving the files that are produced when we build our Angular app. So for serving that code that should be executed in the browser to the browser once the page was loaded. But it's not just that. This server does not just serve the files that should be executed in the browser. Instead, with this line of code here, it in the end also makes sure that the very first page that we visit is pre-rendered on the server, you could say. So a lot of magic is happening behind the scenes here, of course, but in the end it's this line of code combined with some other lines of code in here that makes sure that whenever we send a request for a page to that server, that page is pre-rendered on the server and the finished page is served back to the client. And thereafter, as mentioned before, on that client, so in that browser, we again have a single page application. Now this server TS file also has a couple of other interesting features to which I'll get back later. Right now I would suggest that we simply take a look at this server rendered application. And doing so is quite simple, because in package.json, you will now find some extra scripts which you can execute now that you converted this app to a universal app. For example, this dev::ssr script, which simply runs this Angular app in universal mode and also still in development mode. You could then also build this for universal mode with the build::ssr script, which then would allow you to also serve it in universal mode thereafter. So you would run this command followed by this command if you're ready to deploy this application to a host that supports server-side code, which will be important. But I'll get back to deployment later. So for the moment here, we can simply run npm run dev::ssr to execute this script. So now we're not using ng serve here, but instead we can simply run npm run dev::ssr to run this script, which under the hood runs this command, which we could have executed instead, but which is a bit more to type, which is why we're using the shorter one here. And that will then run our Angular app in server-side mode, in universal mode. Now we see here that, of course, this dev server-side server here is not optimized for production, but it's of course good to use for development. And now with that, if we reload localhost 4200, we still have the Angular app we had before. It still works as before, but if I reload this again and I view this page source again, now we see that something changed. Now there is some context in this file. There are some styles here, some extra JavaScript code, and most importantly here, even though it's a bit hard to read because it's all in one line, but down here we have the content of this website. We can see the navigation with the links there. We can see the welcome to this Angular app text. It's all in this initial page, which is downloaded from the server now, and therefore this is now also what web search crawlers would see. If we open the DevTools again and we throttle everything again, we can also see that this time, if I reload this, it of course will take some time because this also still is in development mode and everything, but you can also see that we see something on the screen already. We're still downloading all these scripts, which we need to make this site interactive, but we can see something on the screen way earlier. We don't see this empty screen for a couple of seconds. Instead, we have some content here because this was prepared on the server, which is totally independent of the device or network speed we have here locally, and it's therefore this finished page that was served by the server. And therefore it's not as bad if we have to wait for some extra JavaScript code to be downloaded and executed, because we do see some content right away. Now I will of course still disable this throttling here, but it of course did now show you that this performance problem can potentially also be solved when using Angular Universal. So converting your Angular app to a Universal app by running this one simple command which I showed you before can really be useful. Of course, only if your app needs that. For example, it might not need that if users need to authenticate anyways, and if you're only targeting users in a fast network, as mentioned before. But many apps could benefit, and as you saw, converting is really easy. Now, I also want to take this chance to take another closer look at this server.ts file, though I will mention right away that chances are high that it changes in some details over time. So when you're watching this video, it might not look exactly the same as it does here in my video. But the general idea and structure, of course, should always be the same. Now, I did already mention that, for example, in the end, this line of code here is responsible for pre-rendering the Angular app or the first page of the app on the server. But I also want to highlight what these lines of code here do. And we'll start with this code block here. This code block here, in the end, is responsible for serving any extra assets, including the JavaScript files that contain your compiled Angular code, to the browser. Because if you open the network tab in the browser and you have that server up and running, that universal server here, you will notice that if you reload this page, a bunch of files are downloaded here, a bunch of JavaScript files and one CSS file. Now these files are in the end all built when you build your Angular app for production, and they will then be stored in a folder of your project. You can see this if you quit that running server and you run npm run build:/ssr to build this application for deployment. When you run this command, you will notice that a dist folder gets created, and that dist folder in the end also contains a nested browser subfolder. And that browser subfolder contains JavaScript and CSS files, which in the end need to be downloaded by the browser when users visit your website, because that code is still needed, even though that first page is pre-rendered, because thereafter, as mentioned before, we still have a SPA, a single page application, so of course all these files still need to be downloaded. And that's exactly what this code here in the server.ts file does. It makes sure that when a browser requests one of these files here, those files are served to the browser correctly, and the browser is therefore able to get these files. That's what this code here is responsible for. Now this code here, on the other hand, does work together with this server engine to pre-render that first page that the user visits. And this code here is required because it in the end captures requests to different paths of your application so that different first pages can be pre-rendered. Because here, if I again run this development Angular Universal server here, you will notice that if I go back to this Angular app, I can not just visit this first page here, but I can also go to About, and if I reload this page will actually have been pre-rendered on the server. And you can see this if you now take another look at the source code of this About page. You also see the content of this page down here in this served HTML file now. And it's this code that in the end is responsible for making sure that different paths of your application can be pre-rendered on the server, not just the main component or the starting component, the starting page component, but instead any page. So you now also got a brief introduction into how Angular Universal generally works. I now want to show you one other pretty interesting feature of this server.ts file. And that's this line of code here, which at the moment is commented out for me here. With this line of code, or similar lines of code being added to your project, you can actually build a full stack application now. And that's a big thing, because up to this point in this course, we built a client-side only application, a single page application where the entire code executed in the browser. Now with Angular Universal, with this app being transformed to a universal app, we suddenly can build a full stack application where we also execute some code on the server. And we can not just do that for pre-rendering the first page, but we can also do this to add an API, a web API, a REST API to our Angular app. Instead of using a third-party service like Firebase, as I did it for demo purposes in this course, we could build our own REST API here. The only important thing to keep in mind here is that the backend routes which you now want to add, so the paths to which requests can be sent from your Angular app, must not clash with routes you are also using on the front end. So if in your route config, you have paths like about here, for example, you must not use these same paths in your server-side code. So for example, listening for requests that start with /about would not be a good idea, because now you would start handling this with server-side code instead of letting the Angular router do its thing. So you would have a clash here. But if you, for example, start with /API and you're then handling different kinds of paths here, like users, you could add the Node code, the Node Express code, to, for example, manage users here and to build a full REST API as part of your full stack Angular Universal app. Now this course, of course, is an Angular course, not a Node or Express course, and therefore we're not going to build such an API here. And if this concept of building a REST API doesn't tell you anything, it would be a good idea to first dive into some Node or Express code anyways. But I definitely wanted to mention this here so that you know that with such an Angular Universal app, you could also take this as a chance to build a full stack app with a backend REST API that lives in the same project and in the same folder and later will be served by the same host as your Angular frontend.